my bag. Sorry.
Okay, we left off on number 9.
I really do like Screwtape letters.
So I want to pick up, look at the first paragraph, and then we're going to skip towards the latter half of the second paragraph. My dear Wormwood, I hope my last letter has convinced you that the trough of dullness or dryness through which your patient is going at present will not of itself give you his soul, but needs to be properly exploited. What forms the exploitation should take, I will now consider. Okay, so notice the point there. Just because someone is going through one of these periods doesn't mean they're necessarily, to kind of follow Screwtape's language, doesn't mean they're necessarily damned already or lost already in any sense. In other words, start getting here on time. In other words, they've got to work on him, okay, or patient, whoever that is. So pick up in the middle of the next paragraph, just over the middle. The sentence that begins, never forget. Never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. Well, what does he mean by that? You know, you got a large swath of Christianity today that says, oh, if it's fun, what?
It's evil.
It's evil. It's sinful. You shouldn't do it. You know? He is saying that pleasure in and of itself is something from God. But notice how he characterizes it. As long as it's healthy, normal, and satisfying. So, obviously, an internet addiction to pornography might be considered a pleasure, I guess. Would it be healthy? Probably not. Would it be normal? No, not by any stretch of the imagination. Satisfying? Maybe in some weird twisted sense. Okay? But it wouldn't satisfy any of those three qualities. So he says, I know we've won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. How is pleasure God's invention? Because he's the creator. Because he made everything. Because without God, obviously, there'd be nothing. Okay?
But even these pleasures she's talking about, healthy, normal, satisfying, something from God. You take sex, for example. Sex has its purpose. It's pleasurable for a purpose. It's when it gets contorted into something different.
Exactly. When it gets contorted into something different or taken outside, to use two of the words he uses, the normal and satisfying form. Okay? As you said, you know, sex is pleasurable. Okay, what about, sorry if this, you know, affects any of you. I don't think it will, but, you know, you never know these days. What about sex with animals? A little outside the norm, probably. Okay, sorry, you know. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. Why? God created the body. Isn't that where most pleasure comes from? Unless you're one of those oddballs and you get pure intellectual pleasure, you know. No. He made the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. So, if that's true, because keep in mind, Screwtape is a liar. If that's true, what does that suggest all the pleasures of the demonic ones, let's say, or the Screwtapes, come from?
Twisted, not normal, satisfying.
Exactly. It is merely a twisting. Okay? Or to use the language that you'll see in the Space Trilogy, a bending. The pleasures that become bent. So, pleasures which our enemy has produced, at times, or in ways, or in degrees, which he has forbidden. Notice ways and degrees kind of parallel or balance healthy, normal, and satisfying. Okay? We're going to see Lewis pick up a lot of these same ideas when we get into Mere Christianity. And in Mere Christianity, he's going to talk about them in very ways or methods, whereas here he's doing it in kind of a fictionalized form. Here it's what's the way I want to put it? Much less threatening, much less direct. Okay? So, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural, less redolent of its maker, that is, reminding them of its maker, and least redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable. An ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. Now, what kind of language is that? That is, can you take that sentence, an ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure, and can you apply that to something that I hope nobody in here is subject to, but maybe, but you've certainly had friends or acquaintances or someone you know who has been?
Yeah, that's drug addiction.
Drug addiction. Exactly.
Or actually any real addictive.
Or any addiction. You know, if you become an alcoholic and you get drunk by drinking a 23.7 ounce beer, okay? As you drink and drink and drink and drink and drink, is a 23.7 ounce beer going to do the same? No, because you're going to develop a tolerance for it. So it'll take 2 or 3 or 4. Same thing with scotch and whiskey and vodka and rum and everything else. Or pot, or a variety of pills, or cocaine, or heroin. It's going to take an increasingly large dose to get a corresponding high. And even that high won't be as great as the first high. Okay? To get the man's soul and give him nothing in return. That's what really gladdens our Father's heart. So if that's really what gladdens our Father, Satan's heart, what would the obverse be? What would really gladden God's heart, so to speak? To get the man's soul and give him everything in return? Or to give the man his soul, his freedom, and to require nothing in return? You know, look at the variety of the epistles of the New Testament, where St. Paul talks about being free in Christ. And yet what does he also say? Being a slave of Christ. How can you be a slave and be free? Okay, that's kind of what he's getting at. So, go on to the next paragraph. Skip a couple lines. Do not let him suspect the law of undulation. That is, don't let your patient even think about this law of waves and troughs, or ebbing and flowing. Let him assume that the first ardors of his conversion might have been expected to last, and ought to have lasted forever, and that his present dryness is an equally permanent condition. Like whenever you start anything new that you're all fired up, you're excited about, it's going great, and then, you know, you're learning a new musical instrument or something, and your first lessons go great, and then you step it up to the next level, and you find out you really, truly, unconditionally suck. I mean, there's just no other way to describe how bad you are. What can you do? You can give up, or you can keep practicing.
Lewis talks about this concept when somebody asks him about marriage and being in love and what love first is in marriage, that first look of love, and how to sustain that, and that it's not that initial love again. It changes. It consistently changes.
Consistently changes, yeah. And in that passage, I think that you're talking about, I mean, one of the things Lewis talks about is it's not an emotion. It's not a feeling. What is love ultimately? It's a commitment. It's a decision. It is, I do, right? Not, oh, I feel okay. Let's do this today. Tomorrow I'll feel different and, we'll go off and do something else. It's not the Vegas version of love, in other words, okay? So, having once got this misconception well fixed in his head, what's the misconception again? That the period of dryness, the period of harshness or hardness or emptiness will be forever. Okay? You may then proceed in various ways. It all depends on whether your man is of the desponding type, who can be tempted to despair, or of the wishful thinking type, who can be assured that all is well. That is, if he is the despairing type, it's pretty easy at this point to just send him down that particular place. Okay? The former type is getting rare among the humans. But if he's of the more hopeful type, your job is to make him acquiesce in the present low temperature of his spirit and gradually become content with it. Get him to accept, well, this is how things are. Persuading him that maybe it's not so low after all. In other words, I once heard a tape of a guy talking about something completely different than what we're discussing. But he used an analogy. And the analogy was of the prodigal son. You all know the parable of the prodigal son. The guy goes off, spends all his fortune, all of his family inheritance, and ends up living in the pigs, rolling in slop and such. And the guy's analogy, I hate when that happens. The guy's analogy was, I'm trying to remember how he said it exactly. It was something to the effect of, the prodigal son needed to go back to the father, rather than the father coming to the son. In other words, it was important that he realized the error of his ways and left and went back to the father, rather than the father coming to him and saying, oh, it's okay, you're fine how you are. Because where was he at that moment? Living in slop, living in pig crap and food and such. Okay? So if you can get him to think that the pig crap he's living in, it's all okay. This is pretty much what everybody's lives are like. Right? In a week or two, you will be making him doubt whether the first days of his Christianity were not perhaps a little excessive. In other words, if you get him to think that living under a bridge is normal, then maybe getting him to think that the house he used to own wasn't really all that good. And that this is just fine. Talk to him about moderation in all things. If you can once get him to the point of thinking that, quote, religion is all very well up to a point, unquote, you can feel quite happy about his soul. Now, what does that mean? Religion is all very well up to a point.
Goes along with the moderation.
Yeah, keep going.
Like, at the beginning, it talks about the church and all its flags and its wave bearing. I think that's what he's talking about here, is that you get carried away with your religion and it rules it.
Yeah.
It rules your whole life.
Don't get too...
He wants religion to be in a box in the corner, not all-encompassing.
Exactly. He wants, your religion, let's say God, to be like this bottle. When you get thirsty, you pull God down off the shelf and you take a couple hits. And God makes you feel better. And then when your life's going along fine and you don't need it anymore, you put it back up on the shelf and you go on with your life. Until you get in a car wreck, you lose your job, everything starts to happen. Where's God when it hurts? Oh, there he is. And you pull him back down off the shelf. That's what it means. A moderated religion is as good for us as no religion at all. And more amusing. Why more amusing? Why would that be more amusing than atheism?
Because those people, go ahead.
I was gonna be like the lukewarm reference that you talking about.
And it doesn't matter whether, as we read and discuss this, whether or not you're individually Christian or atheist or Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim or, it doesn't matter. What we're talking about is how Lewis is suggesting, Screwtape is suggesting this. A moderated religion is as good for us as no religion at all, and more amusing.
Self-deception. This guy, it is funnier to watch this guy fool himself than not.
Exactly. Okay? Skip the next paragraph. You see the idea? Keep his mind off the plain antithesis between true and false. Why? If he's dealing with questions of true and false, what is he doing? Thinking. He's reasoning, which Screwtape has already said. If you're doing that, you're already in the enemy's, playground, as it were. You're playing with the enemy's tools, and that's dangerous. No. Here's what you want. Nice, shadowy expressions. It was a phase. That is, that feeling all warm and fuzzy and glowy. It was a phase. I've been through all that. Have any of you ever experienced that kind of thing? Not in a religious sense, but you jumped on a bandwagon that everybody else seemed to be on, and you felt great about it while you were on the bandwagon, and then after a while you fell off, so to speak. Other people are still on it, and you're thinking, yeah, it's just a phase. I'm beyond that. I've grown up, as it were. And don't forget the blessed word, adolescent. Oh, it's just an adolescent phase. Okay? You hear that kind of talk a lot, for example, in politics. That your opponent's views are adolescent, immature, not responsible, etc. Okay? Now, skip number 10. Got to find some way to get through this book. Go to number 11 and probably the last page. Last two paragraphs. He's talking about humor, okay, and jokes and flippancy and stuff. Okay? Actually, let's go to the second paragraph. I divide the causes of laughter, human laughter, into joy, fun, the joke proper, and flippancy. Okay? You'll see the first, joy, among friends and lovers reunited on the eve of a holiday. Okay? Fun, skipping down to the next paragraph, closely related to joy, a sort of emotional froth arising from the play instinct. As when people will have fun together, okay? Very little use to us. Why? Because the demons know nothing of fun. Just as with joy, they know nothing of joy. The joke proper, which turns on some perception of incongruity, is a much more promising field. That is a real joke. The jokes that make you laugh so hard you nearly wet your pants. Okay? I'm not thinking primarily of indecent or body humor. Truth is, humans are pretty clearly divided on this matter. Skip on down to the next paragraph. The real use of jokes or humor is in quite a different direction, and it is especially promising among the English, who take their sense of humor so seriously, and that is true.
Yes, it is.
Man, is it ever true. take their sense of humor so seriously that a deficiency in this sense is almost the only deficiency at which they feel shame. So if you get a bunch of English folks together and they tell a joke, if someone doesn't get the joke that everybody else gets, it's like there's something individually, morally, existentially wrong with this person. Okay? So, humor is for them, okay, he's talking about the English, the all-consoling, the all-excusing grace of life. Hence, it is invaluable as a means of destroying shame. If a man simply lets others pay for him, he is mean, meaning kind of base, common, vulgar, if he doesn't offer to pay. Okay? If he boasts of it, that is, that somebody else is paying for him, in a jocular manner and twits his fellows with having been scored off, he is no longer mean, but a comical fellow. And they'll laugh, not at him, but with him. They'll think, you're pretty dadgum smart, yet you conned us into paying for you. Okay? Mere cowardice is shameful. Cowardice boasted of with humorous exaggerations and grotesque gestures can be passed off as funny. You need a literary example? Falstaff, the Henry IV plays. Falstaff is a coward through and through, and yet he boasts of it. And he makes fun of it, which makes others accept him. Okay? Cruelty is shameful, unless the cruel man can represent it as a practical joke. And isn't that always the danger with practical jokes? Where's the dividing line between them? 1,000 bawdy or even blasphemous jokes do not help towards a man's damnation, so much as his discovery that almost anything he wants to do can be done, not only without the disapproval, but with the admiration of his fellows, if only it can get itself treated as a joke.
Bullying right now, that every single time I was just joking. Joke.
I was in my office and I was reading a thing about grew up, Piedmont High School, that athletes on the varsity teams apparently came up with, I can't remember what it was even called, came up with a league, kind of like a fantasy football league. This one, however, was a, come on, load, was a fantasy slut league. Okay? Where they would get girls to sleep with them or do a variety of sex acts, and they, the boys, would get points. And there had to be proof of the sex acts. Okay?
So this is fantasy, not meaning not real, but as in what they want to do.
Exactly, exactly. There was a similar instance several years ago, also in California, not surprisingly. And the justification that was given, this was in Fremont, California, the justification that was given by many of the parents of the boys, primarily fathers, was they're boys. Boys will be boys. The girls knew what they were getting into. In other words, it's just a joke. They're just kids. Right? But then he goes into flippancy. Flippancy is the best of all. In the first place, it's economical. Only a clever human can make a real joke about virtue, or indeed about anything else. Any of them can be trained to talk as if virtue were funny. Here's an example that's not necessarily about virtue. And this is from last night's debate, okay? Don't mean to offend anybody. One of the things during one of the foreign policy pieces of the foreign policy debate, which became much more about domestic policy. One of the things that Governor Romney said at one point was he talked about how, you know, our military is shrinking, et cetera, and how we are going to, once the sequestration goes through in January, how we will have fewer ships in our Navy than we had in 1916. Okay? And President Obama launched back and said, well, Governor, I think that's just because you don't know anything about our modern military. And he went on to say, you know, for example, we don't have bayonets or horses today either. And you know, we don't need all these ships because we have these things called aircraft carriers that you land planes on, and then we have these ships that go underwater called submarines. Okay. That was being flippant. By the way, he's just been widely panned today for those comments. That those were beneath presidential, et cetera, because of the sarcastic nature, et cetera. Okay.
Romney handed him a straight line.
Yeah.
I mean, putting aside Screwtape's opinion of humor, just in the whole world of jokes, which I think hold a little higher than Lewis does, he handed him a straight line. It really, I mean, that was obviously a prepared remark.
Oh, yeah.
He was waiting for Romney to hand
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And Romney cooperated.
Yeah, and said, here, hit it out of the park, you know, so to speak. Okay. Among flippant people, the joke is always assumed to have been made. No one actually makes it, but every serious subject is discussed in a manner which implies that they've already found a ridiculous side to it. If prolonged, the habit of flippancy builds up around a man the finest armor plating against the enemy that I know, and it is quite free from the dangers inherent in the other sources of laughter. It is 1,000 miles from joy. In other words, flippancy is not at all like joy. And joy, by the way, is a notion that is, I don't want to say it's unique to Lewis, but it is a word and is a feeling about which Lewis was very serious, okay, which we'll talk about when we get to the book Surprised by Joy. Okay, go on to number 12. We find out at the beginning, Wormwood's doing well. His patient is progressing well. Look at the second paragraph. Okay? And Screwtape says, I'm glad to hear, or almost glad to hear, that he's still a churchgoer, he's still receiving communion, etc. As long as he retains externally the habits of a Christian, he can still be made to think of himself as one who's adopted a few new friends and amusements, but whose spiritual state is much the same as it was 6 weeks ago. Okay, now notice what he said there. As long as he retains externally the habits of a Christian, he can still pretty much remain the same guy he was 6 weeks ago. In other words, what doesn't happen to him? He doesn't change internally. There's nothing going on, except the AC is going to fall through the roof. There's nothing going on inside him. While he thinks that is, that he remains the same as he was, we do not have to contend with the explicit repentance of a definite, fully recognized sin, but only with his vague, though uneasy feeling that he hasn't been doing very well lately. In other words, he's been a quote-unquote Christian for 6 weeks, yet he's not really broken up about it. If to live, hold on, make sure I have to, no, we need to back up. Next paragraph. This dim uneasiness needs careful handling. Because after all, what could it easily blossom into? True repentance. Really feeling sorry, okay, or contrition for what he has done and such. If it gets too strong, may wake him up and spoil the whole game. But if you suppress it entirely, which the enemy probably won't allow you to do, you lose an element in the situation that can be turned to good account. Here's what he means. If such a feeling is allowed to live, but not allowed to become irresistible and flower into real repentance, it has one invaluable tendency. In other words, if this feeling of uneasiness is allowed to go on and never get specified. Never get tied to a specific action on the part of the patient. He says, then we can use it. How? It increases the patient's reluctance to think about the enemy. Well, how does that happen? Because he doesn't think specifically about the quote-unquote sin. If he doesn't think specifically about that, then he doesn't think specifically about the one being sinned against. So if he just feels this general malaise, what's it become? It becomes part of the general malaise of life. Autumn?
Well, if you don't know what what kind of sin you're committing, then you don't know how to truly repent.
True. Okay? So he says, in this state, your patient will not omit, but he will increasingly dislike his religious duties. Let's say the sin is, too much drinking. I mean, he's Englishman after all. Too much drinking. Doesn't mean he's going to stop drinking. But he is going to start feeling antagonistic towards those quote-unquote churchmen who tell him not to drink. Okay? He'll think about them, his religious duties, as little as he feels he decently can beforehand, and forget them as soon as possible when they are over.
Is he talking right here more about the patient not understanding what Lewis calls the moral law that's innate in him?
Oh, yeah.
Versus what culture is saying he should
Yeah.
feel sorry for?
Well,
His Christian culture, I'd say.
not necessarily. It's more of a conflation of the two. Okay? Because what Lewis says in Mere Christianity and Abolition of Man is that moral law that everyone has, that all cultures, all peoples have, is pretty clear. It's the sense of oughtness. I ought to do this. I ought not to do this. And while the things that one ought to do and ought not to do might be different according to the culture you live in, there is still ought to, ought not to. In other words, the particulars are really unimportant. It's the ought or ought notness of the two. Okay? Skip to the next paragraph and go about 7 or 8 lines into it. Lines, not sentences. Talking about trying to get his attention, okay, while it's wandering, and about pleasures and temptations. You no longer need a good book, he says, which he really likes, to keep him from his prayers, or his work, or his sleep. A column of advertisements in yesterday's paper will do. Okay, now notice that. A column of advertisements, ads, in yesterday's paper will do. You can make him waste his time not only in conversation he enjoys with people whom he likes, but in conversations with those he cares nothing about on subjects that bore him. Have any of you experienced this? You don't have to answer that. I have. Okay? I have wasted time looking at things I am not at all interested in, or reading things I'm not at all interested. One wonders what Lewis would have said in Screwtape if he'd had this thing. Because how many people spend way too much time surfing the internet?
Wikipedia link.
Okay.
Especially if there's something else you need to be doing.
I mean, if I were to show you, go to my Firefox thing. My wife's always, harping me about this. If you look at this, I've got like 10 tabs open. Those are sites I regularly read, okay? And usually, regularly read means multiple times a day, okay? That's, I think, what the point is he's trying to get across there.
And then there's Facebook.
And then there's Facebook. which we have not only on these, but on these. I wonder what Lewis would deal, with that too. So, you can make them do nothing at all for long periods. Anybody in here have an experience of that? Wondering where the time went? You can keep them up late at night, not roistering, but staring at a dead fire or I don't have one in here, a blank TV screen in a cold room. All the healthy and outgoing activities which we want them to avoid can be inhibited and nothing given in return. So that at least it may say, as one of my own patients said on his arrival down here, I now see that I spent most of my life in doing neither what I ought nor what I liked. Now, it seems to me that's a pretty important comment that Screwtape is saying to I almost said Woodward. I read an article by Bob Woodward during lunch, to Wormwood about what it is they want to get the patient / us not to do, which is really anything. They don't want us to get to do anything. They want us to just sit and chill, as it were. Okay?
And this sounds like clinical depression he's describing here.
Well, I mean, to some extent it could be.
That
Video game dependent.
That is the state that would please the devil
Oh.
most.
Oh, entirely. Because the person who's clinically depressed is focused where? Yeah. Read, which I think is a fantastic exploration of the ability of the mind to feast on itself. Read Samuel Johnson's Rasselas, or The Prince of Abyssinia, which has a wise man in there who talks about the mind eating itself because it doesn't have something outside to focus on. And that's what the person who's clinically depressed does. They don't look outward. Whenever people turn and look entirely inwardly, and not in a healthy way, because there can be a healthy way of doing that, okay? But look entirely in a negative, unhealthy way, it's the spiral down the drain, okay? Look at number 13. Notice something has happened between 12 and 13. It seems that you have taken a great many pages to tell a very simple story. The long and the short of it is you've let the man slip through your fingers. The situation is grave. A repentance and renewal on what the other side called grace, on the scale which you describe as a defeat of the first order. Okay? As you ought to have known, the asphyxiating cloud which prevented your attacking the patient on his walk back from the old mill is a well-known phenomenon. It is the enemy's most barbarous weapon and generally appears when he is directly present to the patient under certain modes not yet fully classified, meaning we don't have a clue what's going on. Some humans are permanently surrounded by it and therefore inaccessible to us. What does he mean, some humans are permanently surrounded by this? Saints. Saints, who have a direct experience of God. And because they have a direct experience of God, God is never absent from them. Well, the demons can only come up so far, and they kind of, they shy away. So, now for your blunders. First of all, you allowed the patient to read a book he really enjoyed. Not Screwtape letters, but a novel you really enjoy. Because he enjoyed it. In other words, you allowed him to do what? To take pleasure in pleasure. A proper pleasure. A normal pleasure. A satisfying pleasure. Joy. It's really, that's what he's talking about. And not in order to make clever remarks about it to his new friends. In the second place, you allowed him to walk down to the old mill and have tea there. Well, so what? Big deal. Well, what's the point about walking down to the old mill?
He enjoyed it.
He enjoyed it. That is a place through country he really likes and taken alone. Why is it significant that he takes this walk alone?
None of the people that were with him were there, and he could just kind of think without any of those distractions.
Bingo. It allowed him to think. It allowed him to reflect on joy. Okay? In other words, you allowed him two real positive pleasures. The characteristic of pains and pleasures is that they are unmistakably real. And therefore, as far as they go, give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. Now, Lewis is talking about something here that most Westerners kind of take for granted. This idea that what we see around us as real is really real. But if we had an Eastern mindset, if we had been raised in India or Tibet or even some parts of China and such, we would not necessarily accept that as true. We might believe that everything around us is an illusion, that we are an illusion. It's kind of the basis behind Rene Descartes', cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He even got to the place of doubt to say, this isn't real, but by the very fact that I am thinking, that means I am real. Okay, and he argued from that kind of outwardly. So what is he talking about? Pain and pleasure are touchstones of reality. Another story. Guy, a long time ago, was a pretty big influence on my life. He used to give a lot of lectures and stuff. He lived in Switzerland. Give a lot of lectures and stuff to places like Harvard and Cambridge and Oxford and stuff in the 60s. At one point was in a student's room in Oxford. This is about 68 or so. And he's talking to a group of students answering philosophical and theological questions and such. And this one student, an Indian, said, yes, but so-and-so, the problem is I don't really believe that you are real. I don't believe you are real. And what the individual said was, well, I can honor that. I can accept that. And he went to a hot pot or hot plate, and he got a teapot that was sitting on there and boiling, and he walked up to the gentleman, and he got ready to pour the boiling hot water in his lap. The guy, whoa! Point proved. If he's not really there, then that's not really boiling water. That is scalding my groin. And that's not really my groin. It's just, my thought thinking about it. Okay? Thus, if you've been trying to damn your man by the romantic method, by making him a kind of child Harold or Werther, submerged in self-pity for imaginary distresses, you try to protect him at all costs from any real pain. Because, of course, 5 minutes genuine toothache would reveal the romantic sorrows for the nonsense they were, and unmask your old stratagem. But you were trying to damn your patient by the world. That is, by palming off vanity, bustle, irony, and expensive tedium as pleasures. How could you fail to see that a real pleasure was the last thing you ought to have let it meet? Not an imaginary pleasure, but something you really, truly enjoyed. Not the kind of pleasure that people say, oh, well, you ought to enjoy Shakespeare. And so you take a Shakespeare class, or you read a Shakespeare play, or you go to see a Shakespeare play and you think, and you tell yourself, I really ought to like this, and yet you just absolutely hate it. Okay? If you absolutely hate it, then what does that mean? That you're somehow intellectually or literately deficient? No, it means Shakespeare is not your cup of tea. It might mean that something else is your cup of tea. So, next paragraph. Of course, I know that the enemy also wants to detach men from themselves, but in a different way. How does he want to? Remember always, he really likes the little vermin and sets an absurd value on the distinctness of every one of them. When he talks of their losing themselves, he only means abandoning the clamor of self-will. And I almost think that if Lewis were to rewrite this today, after writing the Space Trilogy, Chronicles of Narnia, Till We Have Faces, Surprised by Joy, and A Grief Observed, he probably would have said the clamoring of self. Just self. Once they've done that, he really gives them back all their personality. That's what it means to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Because who really wants to deny themselves? You know, most people when they're hungry, what do? Eat. When they're sleepy, what do? Sleep. When they're blank, what do? Blank. Okay. They fill those desires and or needs. Do we eat only when we're hungry? No. Do we sleep only when we need sleep? No. Do we talk only when we need to communicate? No. Do we blank only when we need? No. So why are we doing it? To satisfy the self. The self's need to be heard. The self's desire to sate the body. Okay. He really gives them back all their personality and boasts sincerely that when they're wholly his, they will be more themselves than ever. In other words, when they're entirely 100% completely God's, they will be even more distinct from God. That's what you call what? A paradox. Okay? The deepest likings and impulses of any man are the raw material, the starting point with which the enemy has furnished him. For example, why do most people get married? Or why do most of the people who get married get married? Is it because of sex? Is it companionship? Why do most people, let me back out of that one, have friends?
Need to move their furniture.
I need to move their furniture. Okay. Why else? So, what do most people need? Yeah. Companionship. Why? We're not built to be alone. We're not made to be alone. We're not complete alone. Okay? The deepest likings and impulses of any man are the raw material. You know? People say, home is what? Where the heart is. Okay? What does that mean? What does that mean home is where the heart is? I mean, you could say, hey, it's wherever you are. That's where the heart is. Not really what it means.
Home isn't like a physical location in space. It's it has a lot to do with your emotional tie to.
Emotional tie to what?
Where you belong.
Others, where you belong. I think it is ultimately about that. Acceptance. Home is where you, or where you ought to be, except for in dysfunctional homes, where you ought to be accepted without question. Period. Because when you come to school, do you feel completely, totally accepted? I sure hope not, because if you do, then something's wrong. Okay? Because what do you do when you come to school or when you go to work?
You leave home.
You leave home, but what else?
You have to monitor your behavior towards other people.
Okay, so monitor your behavior towards other people's behavior. It's a long, fancy way of saying you put on a mask. I step through the door and I put on professor mask. I go home with my kids, I put on father mask. I see my wife and I'm husband mask. I go to church and I see I'm subdeacon mask. I go do this and I'm helper mask. And Home, okay, is, hello, ultimately no mess. Raw, unexpurgated, just plain old horrible, rotten me kind of a thing. Okay? To get him away from what? From the likings and impulses. To get him away from those is therefore always a point gained. That is, to get him away from the things that he really likes in life. For our patient here, the walk down to the old mill. For Lewis, it was Addison's walk outside Magdalen College. Okay? At Magdalen College, you have the High Street. I think it's the High Street. It's either high or broad. Down here in Oxford, you go through the Porter's Gate into Magdalen College, because this is all wall. You go through the little doors here, and you enter an open courtyard. You come around this way, and you come through another little gate here, and there's a big open yard area with a great big huge plane tree over here. And you have what's called new buildings back here. And Lewis had rooms over here, okay, when he was professor at Oxford. You come out through a little walkway here, and you have this little river. It's this huge walk, a couple miles long. This is a huge deer field over here, and then you've got another deer field over here, because Lewis used to see deer out his windows. Sometimes he would even feed them. He would come out here and go on this walk, and it was a place of peace. I mean, you're less than a couple hundred yards from the road in Oxford, but it's quiet and silent. That's what the idea that he's talking about. To get him away from those is therefore always a point gained. Even in things indifferent, it is always desirable to substitute the standards of the world, or convention, or fashion, for a human's own real likings and dislikings. So, say for example, you like a certain show on TV, but everybody tells you ought to try X, Y, or Z. And X, Y, or Z just don't float your boat. I mean, it's just boring to you. Yet, to follow the tempter's advice means you force yourself to attempt to like them. Go on to graduate school. Man, are you going to experience this. Because you're going to be told, oh, you ought to fall in love with this theorist or that theorist, or this work of literature or that work of literature. You know, I've got a PhD. I've been teaching 20 years. I've never finished Moby Dick. I never will. I will never pick that book up again as long as I live, unless it's to throw it in a fire. Anybody ever wrote. I mean, Melville should have stopped after Call Me Ishmael. It's one of the greatest opening lines of literature, but it goes downhill from that. Okay? And that's only 3 words. So, get him to want to get moved by the pleasures of the world or convention or fashion. You should always try to make the patient abandon the people or food or books he really likes in favor of what? The best people, the best food, the important books. The important books. Man, that's a simple reason that Tolkien is a perfectionist. Here, 2 months. Okay? In other words, in order to get here on yourself, you're off helping somebody, you know, you're helping friends move, etc. The thought should never be, oh, I'm a good person. This for you, it's somebody else. No. Let him think of it not as self-forgetfulness, but as a certain kind of opinion, namely a low opinion of his own talents and character. Should Steve Jobs have had a low opinion of his ability as a CEO and marketer and innovator in technology? Hell no. Why? He was a genius. Okay? Just an absolute genius. Should Einstein have had a low opinion of himself as a mathematician? He failed math in high school, by the way. No. He was a genius. So humility does not mean, oh, I'm horrible. I'm just the worst person in the world. Oh, I only got a B on that test. life sucks, think I'll go kill myself, That's not what it means. If anything, it's really a realistic opinion of one's abilities.
Either of those men had thought of themselves as a father rather than as a genius, you would be forced to accept his own limitations in those respects, and that's, I think, where their humility could start.
There's a difference between accepting those things and acknowledging them and bringing that out as everything that you are in public.
Think of an athlete. An athlete who trains and trains and trains and does something that most people would consider phenomenal. Is that something he or she should be humble about? Humble in the sense of, oh, well, it's not really me. No! If they trained and trained and trained for years to reach the level of ability they reached, okay, that is something to be achieved. That is something to be proud of. Okay? There's a big difference between that, however, and trying to think of a bad example of false humility in public.
Well, Michael Phelps claimed he was the greatest athlete.
Michael
of all
Phelps' claim.
time, period.
Yeah, but that's not humility. That's just arrogance. Because I think a few people would have, Lance Armstrong, would maybe have a disagreement with that, or Bruce Jenner from the 1976 Olympics would have a,
Or Babe Dietrichson.
yeah,
Female.
or Diana Nyad, swimmer who has attempted three times now, to swim from Cuba to Florida. She always fails because the Portuguese man of war get her and nearly kill her. Okay. The great thing is to make him value an opinion for some quality other than truth, thus introducing an element of dishonesty and make-believe into the heart of what otherwise starts to become a virtue. Okay? Skip several lines. The enemy wants to bring the man to a state of mind in which he could design the best cathedral in the world and know it to be the best and rejoice in the fact without being any more or less or otherwise glad at having done it than he would be if it had been done by another. Okay? In other words, to have that architect take glory not in what he did, but in the thing produced, and to see that even if that thing produced had been produced by somebody else, it would still be worthy of glory, even though it wouldn't have been his. The enemy has any bias in his own favor that he can rejoice in his own talents as frankly and gratefully as in his neighbor's talents. For example, a literary example. When Beowulf first arrives at the court of Hrothgar, the land of the the land of the Danes, he says, "My men and I have come here, we've heard about Grendel," and then he changes into first person. "I want to defeat Grendel. I will do this. I will fight him mano a monstro, without any weapons, etc." And he says, "I will do this. God will grant victory to whichever one he chooses." Okay? I. Grendel gets killed. What does Beowulf say the following morning? We did this. We did it. He doesn't take the glory for himself. Okay? The enemy to result in his own talents. He wants each man in the long run to be able to recognize all creatures as glorious and excellent things. He wants to kill their animal self-love as soon as possible. It is in his long-term policy, I fear, to restore to them a new kind of self-love, a charity and gratitude for all selves, including their own. Now, you hear talk in political campaigns about American exceptionalism and such. does the celebration of quote-unquote American exceptionalism mean that in American exceptionalism, thereby or therefore say England is unexceptional or Britain is unexceptional or Germany? No. It's not what it means. Okay? It doesn't mean that we are saying we are the absolute best country in the world by far, and there's nothing wrong with us. It's not what it means. Okay? He wants to restore a new kind of self-love, a charity and gratitude for all selves, including their own. When they've really learned to love their neighbors as themselves, then, I'm throwing in the then, they will be allowed to love themselves as their neighbors. Okay? So what he's getting at with this whole point of humility is that it's recognizing others. Sound like anything from the essay on fairy stories? It's part of recovery. Seeing the uniqueness of all others. 15. Okay? Talking about the war. Humans live in time, but our enemy destines them to eternity. Skip the next sentence. For the present is the point at which time touches eternity. Oft quoted line from Lewis. The present is the point at which time touches eternity. Because for us, living alive today, right now, this minute, how real for us right now is 10 minutes ago? It's gone. Can never be brought back. How real for us right now is 10 minutes from now? It's unreal. It's an imaginary thing. It is a shadow. We don't know that there will be a 10 minutes from now. We think there will, because yesterday at this time, there was a 10 minutes from now. Okay? Of the present moment, and of it only, humans have an experience analogous to the experience which your enemy has of reality as a whole. In it alone, freedom and actuality are offered them. Notice that what he says there about God. God, for God, the present, okay, is reality as a whole. He would therefore have them continually concerned either with eternity, that is God, would have us concerned with eternity, which means being concerned with him, or with the present, either meditating on their eternal union with or separation from himself, or obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing the present cross, receiving the present grace, giving thanks for the present pleasure. Notice the two options there. Right here, right now, or eternity. What are not included in the options? Tomorrow and yesterday. The future here and the past. Our business is to get them away from the eternal and from the present. Look at every presidential campaign you can remember. And what are they always about?
Future.
The future. We even have one presidential candidate whose campaign slogan is one word. And what's it about? Forward. Not now. Is it tomorrow that 23 million will go back to work? Or does it start now? Okay? It is far better to make them live in the future. Or, I'm adding this, to make them think back about the glories of the past. Lo, we have heard of the glory days of the spear danes of old. Beowulf begins. That is a poet saying, remember back when my grandpappy was young and when men were men. Okay? In a word, the future is of all things the least like eternity. It is the most completely temporal part of time. For the past that's frozen no longer flows. Meaning, you know what? On September 1st, 1939, or was it September 3rd? September 1st, 1939, That will always be the day that Hitler marched into Poland. December 7th, 1941 will always be, for all time, the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. That will never change. Nobody's going to get a time turner and go back and, get a redo. Tomorrow? Tomorrow is what? There are a billion possibilities of what tomorrow could be. What makes those possibilities become a reality of right now? Because right now is now, and it's now, and it's now. Okay? So, hence the encouragement we have given to all those schemes of thought such as creative evolution, scientific humanism, communism, which fix men's affections on the future. Why does he mention communism with evolution and scientific humanism? The very basis of communism is not now. It's building this perfect society. When? In the future. When has it existed in terms of actual human history? Never. Why? Because it's always going to be in the future. Because you're always going to have this half of the people who say, screw you, we're taking the goods, we're going to be the Politburo, and you guys are going to be the proles. And you're going to work for us. And we're going to have the nice dachas and various, other nice things. Okay? Go to the second to the last paragraph, the last sentence. We want a whole race, perpetually in pursuit of the rainbow's end. Man, how many people live their lives like that? Now, we don't literally think about a rainbow having a pot of gold at the end. Where is the rainbow in our popular existence? Powerball? Jackpot lottery? I mean, talk about your pie in the sky, rainbow fairy, leprechauns. Sure, somebody wins. Out of how many tickets sold? How likely? What is the probability of one receiving that payoff? Not great. But always using as mere fuel wherewith to heap the altar of the future every real gift which is offered them in the present. That is, they use the real gifts given to them now and they throw them away for what they're seeking in the future. You're going to see the language is going to be used in Paralandra by the Green Lady, the Queen of Paralandra. She's going to come to this realization that she can accept the gift that is given to her now, or she can deny that gift to look forward to the gift she wants. That may never be coming. Think of it in terms of Christmas. You can have this gift now, or maybe something else.
Those game shows in the 1980s. $1,000 or number 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, which one do you want? Or you go to a Harris in Las Vegas. You play the slot, you win $500, and what's your choice?
Keep it going.
Ooh, there's $500 of quarters. Well, yeah. One more won't hurt, or 5 more, or 10 more, or 100 more. Because I've known people who have literally done that. They've won a jackpot on the slot machine, and then they've blown it all, thinking, I'll get a double jackpot. Okay? 16. Surely, last sentence of the first paragraph. Surely you know that if a man can't be cured of church going, the next best thing is to send him all over the neighborhood looking for the church that suits him until he becomes a taster or connoisseur of churches. What do we call this today? Church hopping or church shopping. Like you go shopping for different brands of cereal. Here's your your kashi, all natural tree bark and grass. Here's your sugary, Captain Crunch. Here's your bran flakes. Here's your oatmeal. Here's your blah, blah, blah. Here's your, in the United States, or take that back, around the world, in the Protestant denomination, largely configured, there's over 22,000 different brands. Okay? So, if you go to this one, it doesn't quite fit you because the pastor or preacher is a little too fire and brimstone, he's making you feel a little guilty, you can go to this one, where there's no talk about fire and brimstone, and it's all, can we just be nice and play with sock puppets or something? Be nice to each other. Okay? He says, you want to keep this up. Why? Look at the middle of the next paragraph, about a third of the way into the next paragraph. Skipping the first place. In the second place, the search for a suitable church makes the man a critic, where the enemy wants him to be a pupil, a student, to sit and learn and be taught. And instead, what does he do? He puts himself above the church and says, on my grading scale, my criteria, you are lacking in. And yet, on what basis does he make that determination? None. His own personal desires. Okay? Next paragraph. 2 churches nearest to him I've looked up in the office. The first of these, the vicar, is a man who's been so long engaged in watering down the faith to make it easier for a supposedly incredulous and hard-headed congregation that it is now he who shocks his parishioners with his unbelief. Okay? He wants to make it easier for a supposedly incredulous. What does the word incredulous mean? Unbelievable. Okay, if the congregation is supposedly unbelievable, that is unbelieving, then what's the problem? They will never believe. Okay? So what does he do? Screwtape says he waters it down so much so that you have in Protestant denominations again, churches where you have a Christ who is not the Son of God, okay, where you have a God who is not God per se, but it's just kind of the amorphous, kind of like the Force, okay, and there's no sin really. It's just more of, well, how do you really feel about that? It's kind of the church of psychoanalytical counseling. Well, sit down on the couch and let's talk about that. Okay? At the other church, we have Father Spike. Okay? The man, Father Spike, cannot bring himself to preach anything which is not calculated to shock, grieve, puzzle, or humiliate his parents and their friends. So you have one who really doesn't believe anything, and the other one who just wants to rile people. There is also a promising streak of dishonesty in him. We are teaching him to say the teaching of the church is, when he really means, I'm almost sure I read recently in Maritain. Maritain was a French Catholic philosopher/theologian, Jacques Maritain. But I must warn you that he has one fatal defect. He really believes. That is, this guy, Father Spike, he's adopted a lot of the current language. Okay? He's using current philosophical language, like existentialism and such. But, because that's what Jacques Maritain did, but he believes. Okay? Go on to 17. The contemptuous way in which you spoke of gluttony as a means of catching souls in your last letter only shows your ignorance. Notice contemptuous. Wormwood didn't think talking about gluttony or using gluttony would really work very well. Screwtape says, buddy, you've got it all wrong. This has largely been affected by concentrating the human conscience about gluttony, has been concentrating on all of our efforts on gluttony of delicacy, not gluttony of excess. In other words, he's saying our PR department has gotten them to think of gluttony as merely being only wanting the very finest of the things that you have in life. So if you drink wine, it's a $50 bottle of wine rather than a $12 bottle of wine. If you eat steak, it's a New York porterhouse. It's a $15 a pound price rather than a $5 a pound cut. Okay? As opposed to gluttony of excess. Now, keep in mind he's writing this in 1939, but frankly, I think he's writing to 2012 America, which has more gluttony of excess than anything else. How do you know? Go look outside people's homes on trash day. Especially people, with 2 people in the home, and they've got 2 trash cans of garbage. It's a lot of trash. Talks about glucose and the patient's mother. I'm going to skip some of that. Go down to the bottom of that paragraph, or actually about 2/3 of the way down. When he says, you see, because what she wants is smaller and less costly than what has been set before her, she never recognizes as gluttony her determination to get what she wants, however troublesome it may be to others. Now, some of this, I don't know about you, but boy does it hit home with me. Okay? Putting down something in front of her and she doesn't really want it. Why? Because it's not what she asked for. And what she wanted was actually less expensive. And yet maybe harder to get. Or it's just not what they have. And so she won't eat it because it's not what she wants. I've got children like that. Had children like that. I beat it out of them. At the very moment of indulging her appetite, she believes she's practicing temperance. Why? Because she doesn't want the most expensive thing. The real value of the quiet, unobtrusive work, which clearly we're not going to be able to finish that. So, what are we going to do here? Okay, we're going to start with Mere Christianity on Thursday. And what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to do the rest of this on a video lecture. Or we just don't. You finish reading it, obviously, but we just don't finish discussing it. It doesn't matter to me. I'll try and do a video lecture for it. Because we've got to try to stay on from this point on out. We're probably going to skip 1 or 2 of the novels in the Space Trilogy. Not skip, not read. Skip discussing in class. Okay? Probably Out of the Silent Planet, which is pretty simplistic. Actually, I may just spend some time and say we're going to discuss the very end of it.